Welcome, and thanks for joining today's webinar, Neurodiversity in Jesuit Higher Education Today, Challenges and Opportunities. I'm Jim McCartan of Fordham University's Theology faculty. I'm the chair of the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education, which publishes the magazine Conversations on Jesuit Higher Education, today's sponsor. Before we begin, I want to invite audience members to share your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time during today's webinar. Later, during the discussion portion of the program, our panelists will have a chance to respond to your questions. And now a quick introduction. Joe McCleary is a member of the psychology department at St. Joseph's University, where he also serves as executive director of academic programs for the Kinney Center for Autism Education and Support. His research covers a variety of topics around neurodiversity, including the development and evaluation of cognitive behavioral interventions for people with autism spectrum disorder. And Joe has been gracious to serve as our moderator for today's webinar. I turn things over to you, Joe. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCartan. This is just such a great opportunity, and I appreciate the time you've taken to reach out to each of us, identify us, and to invite us to participate in this event. And I'm excited to hear from these speakers. We'll have three speakers in the first half an hour or so who will go in turn, and then we'll have a lot of open discussion at the end, and we hope that we'll be able to make some progress in developing insights and ideas and actions following from this event. The first, I'm going to introduce the three speakers broadly, and then turn it over to our first speaker. Our first speaker will be Brooke Kowalke. She's a professor in English and Medical Humanities at Creighton University in Omaha, Nebraska. And she takes a narrative approach to identifying insights and methods for support for neurodiverse individuals. Then Emily Raclaw will speak. She is a licensed professional counselor, so a clinician. She's also the director of the On Your Mark program at Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and where she focuses on neurodiverse student support. And she's going to speak with us about some of her ideas for advocating for neurodiversity as part of a DEI framework. And finally, we have Dan Bowman, who is at Taylor University, professor in the English department, neurodiverse himself, and has recently published, well, a few years ago, published a book titled On the Spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity. And the part of the focus will be on involvement and integration of neurodiverse people into campus faith communities. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Brooke.
Thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. I'm going to begin us by thinking about neurodiversity and stories in Jesuit higher education. And I'm actually going to start us by telling a little bit of a story. So when I arrived at Creighton, fresh out of grad school in 2004, I remember really struggling to figure out what my professional and professorial identity was going to be. So I remember thinking back to the professors I had had in undergrad and grad school and thought, well, my safest bet's probably just to do what I know, right? What's been, what I saw them doing. And so, for better or for worse, or probably for not the better, that often meant that I assigned kind of punishing workloads to my students, and any flexibility in the syllabus was reserved only for those who were experiencing true emergencies, whatever that means. And those practices I found were really at odds with my inclinations, but I persisted in them nonetheless. My perspective started to shift post-tenure while I was parenting neurodivergent children, experiencing some personal losses that affected my professional life, and rethinking the stories I had been telling myself about my identity and the identities of my students. So I also, at that time, was shifting my professional focus to the medical humanities with a particular focus on neurodiversity, including intellectual disability, and the literary representation of other stigmatized health experiences. And then COVID happened, and the whole world learned about needing accommodations and different kinds of accessibility. So a little bit of framework from where I'm coming from. So why stories matter? I'm coming at this from as an English professor, so obviously I'm biased, but I think stories matter because the ones that we read and the ones we're told allow us to live through an experience as we read about it. As a result, as Louise Rosenblatt argues, we can be transformed. So similarly, Rita Sharon and others have pointed out how telling our stories holds power as we make meaning of our experience and share that meaning with ourselves and with others. So neurodiverse stories, I think, often address experiences of being made to feel as if there's only one right way to do or think things, of being made to feel excluded, of being unheard and unseen on one's own terms. So why do neurodiverse stories matter more particularly then? I think obviously they matter because representation matters. They also matter because, as James Russell Savarese points out, they can help us practice paradoxical thinking. They can help us get rid of reductive binaries, and they can help us practice more humane care for one another. And this, I think, is where the potential for transformation comes in. So kind of the big question I want to be thinking through today is how can neurodiverse stories help transform our educational practices? And for me, the best way to think about that is by asking more questions. So I'm going to kind of lead us through some questions to help us reflect on that. So when we're thinking about transforming our pedagogies in light of neurodiverse stories, I think we can ask ourselves, what stories have I been inherited, or what stories have I inherited or been taught? What stories am I hearing? What stories am I including or excluding in my course content or my educational space more broadly? What stories am I telling with my pedagogy? And how do these stories affect the way I think about, support, and or include my neurodivergent self, students, colleagues? So, as I mentioned, and as we all know, the outbreak of the COVID-19 global pandemic really disrupted kind of our normal ways of doing things. But it didn't take very long before people were talking about a return to normal. And now lots of places insist that we've done that. We've returned to normal. But I think it turns out, right, the idea of normal doesn't really serve anyone well. It requires conformity to a standard that works well for systems, but doesn't always work well for individuals. And I think we can see this as we examine the stories that we've inherited along the way of our own education and development as educators. So Gill and Myers, in their Recognizing Student Voice in Inclusive Higher Education, highlight one particular story about rigor, intellect, and knowledge that maybe some of us have inherited. And they say that inclusive higher education can be understood as a battleground on what counts as, or frankly, who belongs in higher education. Behind this line of thinking is a belief that focusing on making higher education more welcoming, more accessible for all, will upset the rigor and prestige that many college campuses base their reputations upon. So some kind of keywords there, right, about rigor, prestige, reputation. And I think we can see these stories intersecting with our thinking about neurodiversity in a lot of places. I've highlighted two here. One is from Ivanova Smith's work on why intellectual disability needs to be included under the umbrella of neurodiversity, and I've linked her post there. But she says, by saying you have to use academic words and not use plain language materials, that is how autistics with intellectual disabilities are silenced. Or Robert Chapman, in his book, Empire of Normality, suggests that the concept of health has been conflated with normality and productivity. And I want us just to kind of like notice the weight of those words for a minute. Who decides how we define normality and productivity, and why? Then I think we can also think about the stories we're told. So what stories am I hearing from my institutional culture? What am I learning in my research and or my professional development? What are my students and colleagues telling me about their lived experiences? What stories am I telling myself about my own professional identity as an educator? And again, coming back to Robert Chapman, who talks about how he really realized that the dominant medicalized narrative suggested that being autistic made me somehow tragic, broken, in need of fixing. This is a story he was being told. This narrative reinforced the constant messages I had received since school, indicating that there was something inherently wrong with me. So hearing these stories from a number of different perspectives. So next, I think we can think about the stories that we might be excluding from our educational spaces, whether that's intentionally or unintentionally. And we can think about what stories we're including in our educational space. So we know that inclusion and representation matter. How can we create educational spaces that are inclusive of and represent neurodiversity? So the list that I've included there are some texts that I've recently taught. They're a sample of stories of neurodiversity that's pretty broadly defined. Some are first-person narratives, some are fictionalized stories. In the case of Joan is Okay, the narrator's never explicitly identified as neurodivergent, though she's been read that way by some reviewers. I've read her that way. My students sometimes read her that way. All of those stories, I would say, really challenge readers to think more broadly about the connections that often get made between particular kinds of minds, particular modes of cognition, and our very sense of personhood. All of them give us an opportunity to think more about the Jesuit charisms of cura personalis and of forming agents of change. So that's where I want to turn next, is to really think about, okay, well, what difference does a Jesuit context make? So I would say that in a Jesuit context, inclusive pedagogy is grounded in cura personalis, or the care for the whole person. So this might practically look like rethinking some of our classroom practices, keeping neurodiversity in mind. For example, we might rework our participation requirements or guidelines. We might rethink our attendance policies. We might adjust how we deal with late penalties. Maybe we think how we use group work versus individual work differently. Maybe we consider that there might be multiple ways of demonstrating knowledge. Maybe we change our grading methods and practices. And I'd be happy to discuss the particulars of my own experiments in those areas later, if that's of interest. And then when it comes to forming and educating agents of change, I think teaching and telling neurodiverse stories can do that, can also help us be agents of change. So I work with a lot of pre-health students and medical students, and the connection there seems pretty clear, that I can think, okay, these students can hear these stories, they can identify with some of these stories, or maybe they don't. But in either case, I hope they will treat their neurodivergent patient selves and colleagues better and with more creativity and imagination because of the readings we do and the conversations we have in class. But as I always tell my students, even if you're not pre-health, this is really for all of us. We're all humans interacting with other humans, and we can all care for each other better. So all of this for me is really grounded in a care ethics approach to reading and teaching, one that responds creatively to the particularities of individuals and their experiences. So I'll leave us with one last question, and that is just to really think about, what story do I want to tell my neurodivergent students, colleagues, self with my pedagogy, and how can Jesuit charisms help me make choices that better attend to neurodiversity? So I've listed a whole bunch of resources in here because I couldn't help myself. So that link will be available. But really, I just want to say thank you for the time to share some of these stories with you.
Thank you so much. So if you have any questions for Dr. Kowalski, please type them in, and Dr. McCartan will look over those, and then we'll include some of those to the point that we have time at the end. So love to hear all of your thoughts on this. I have some of my own as well. The one thing I wanted to mention is just this idea of questioning systems and structures, and how society as a whole has started to question systems and structures, as was brought up, and how that has contributed to empowerment of the DEI movement. So I'm going to pass it over now to Emily Reclaw, who's going to speak about neurodiversity, partially in the context of DEI.
Thank you. Brooke, you kind of set me up to fail here. I thought you were going to mess up sharing your screen so that I could mess up and be just okay with it. So let's see what I got. Are we seeing slides? Awesome. So as it says, neurodiversity is diversity. Also, you'll have to pardon my voice in case you couldn't tell. I am not at full capacity right now. So one of the questions I was tasked with was addressing, why is neurodiversity frequently overlooked in DEI efforts? And the answer is quite simple. Neurodiversity is also almost always paired with disability, and disability is also incorrectly not included with DEI. And this is mostly because instead of being viewed as an identity, disability is viewed at best as an inconvenient legal obligation versus an identity. And while some neurodivergent folks don't consider their neurodivergence a disability, I consider mine a disability. It's because the differences in our neurotype become disabling due to the environments in which we are expected to operate. Additionally, unlike other DEI targeted populations, neurodiversity isn't tied to any outward appearance. However, it's just as part of my identity as a Black woman as it is that I'm neurodivergent. And so I have this really fun, I hope it didn't change. Let's see. Very fun graphic showing the overlap between neurodiversity and all the other identities that I also, well, don't also share, but we should also consider with people. And so because of these identities that are all intersectional, by looking at neurodiversity as diversity, we can be actually more inclusive. Campuses across our country, are striving to create a more welcoming and inclusive environment, and it goes beyond just the classroom, but into all aspects of student life, from acceptance to graduation. Jesuit institutions, with the core tenet of cura personalis, there's that word again, we must be at the forefront of this. The best way to do this is to consider using the addressing model. I hope this is the right slide. It's being weird for me. So using the addressing model of intersectionality as a framework for diversity, equity, inclusion. It was first developed by Pamela Hayes to reflect social and cultural diversity in research. And this addressing model really addresses all forms of someone's identity, or most components of people's identity. So age, disability, religion, ethnicity, or race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, nationality and language, indigenous group membership, and gender. All things that we usually consider with DEI, except for disability. It's not a dirty word, I promise. And so while this originally was developed to consider what research should look like, this should and could be really easily applied to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging goals of institutions. In searching for more practical ways to implement this model within On Your Mark at Marquette and Marquette University as a whole, I've found that DO-IT, so Disabilities, Opportunity, Internetworking, and Technology, out of the University of Washington, they developed a framework that utilizes universal design, reflecting into DEI throughout higher ed. So in viewing universal design and transparency through a lens of neurodiversity with the goal of creating a more inclusive environment at all levels of the institution, campuses can address intersectional identities that students hold, and therefore you'll improve the outcomes for all students. Universal design approach can streamline the accommodation process. Brooke gave some really good examples of how we can do that by eliminating deficits in products in the environment that make them inaccessible to some people. Such approaches assert that accessibility barriers often stem from the failure of designers to consider the needs of individuals with a wide range of characteristics, going back to those intersectional identities, right? So a great example of this is, everyone remembers the spring of 2020, the fall of 2020, as we were welcoming these new students. I'm going to stop sharing because it's creeping me out. Sorry, my neurodiversity is on fire right now and my brain isn't focusing. So remember when we were welcoming our class in the fall of 2020, and every university was like, how do we make sure that students know what to do when they get here? And we had videos that detailed exactly what the res halls look like, details that look like showing what you're going to do when you check in, what you can expect in almost every aspect of campus that students are going to be experiencing. What happened to that? For example, side quest, sorry. For example, when I'm going to a new restaurant, I will look at the menu, try to figure out what is the food I'm really going to eat, practice saying what I'm going to order, and role play it in my head of, what if they say this? What if they're out? What's my backup going to be? I didn't realize until a week ago that not everyone did that. So by doing those things as universal design to make people feel more welcome, knowing what we can make that invisible expectations visible, assuming that everyone is not coming with the same background, the same values, the same experience, we can really meet all students where they're at, not just neurodivergent students, but our first generation students, our Black and Brown students, our Indigenous students, our students who just don't belong to like the majority groups. By using universal design, looking through the lens of neurodiversity, we can really make people more inclusive. I have more I was going to say, but my voice is tapped out. So if we can pass it to Dan, that'd be great. Sorry.
No problem at all. And please drink some water or something else because I want to hear more from you in the discussion at the end. So thanks for all that information and, just presenting this, firsthand account, but then, above that as well, because you're supporting these students. And my understanding is that you're supporting a diverse set of students, right? Are you supporting anxious students and students with ADHD who don't have autism as well? And that's
Yes.
the model that, I think a lot of universities who haven't gotten into this need to really be thinking about, because the things that you're talking about, that you're experiencing, they cut across a lot of students. And now we're not just talking a small population on campus, we're talking a lot of students on campus who would benefit from those modifications. So we'll talk more about that at the end, I hope. But again, anyone who has questions related to Emily's talk, please put them in the chat. We'd love to hear them and discuss them after Dan speaks. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dan.
Well, thanks for everything so far. That's been really great. The way I was thinking about this is I wanted to be just really practical and really accessible. So it's kind of a great setup for both of you with some excellent ideas. I definitely am a neurodivergent storyteller. That's number one for me. So I feel like I'm at a disadvantage sometimes in these settings because in different instances, I've it's the expectation maybe has been that I will have some theology, or that I'll be a scholar of disability, or I'll be something, and I'm not any of those things. So my book on the spectrum, Autism, Faith, and the Gifts of Neurodiversity is just a memoir in essays. And I'm actually working on, I just signed a contract to work on a young adult graphic novel featuring an autistic main character. So my role kind of is to keep developing an autistic literature, I think, and keep telling those stories, and I'm excited about that. But in terms of what I was tasked with today, I wanted to talk about how to help neurodivergent students, and this is something that I do pretty much every day. I don't think a day goes by when I'm not working with a neurodivergent student. So what I was going to do is just share a couple very simple slides. These are from a different project that I just finished, and so I haven't made any adjustments or anything. These are kind of public facing and not very academic, but just sort of simple and accessible. But I'll talk through them the best I can, if I can get the sharing thing to work. I've got to figure that out. I had a color scheme here that is a little wonky. If you saw the entire presentation, it would make more sense. But so I'm sorry that these the colors are a little weird. But some of the barriers to take into account when working with autistic students and young people, for me, I often see unwelcoming sensory environments can be tough. This includes, like, if I go to have coffee with an autistic student at the student union, it's better to go at 2:30 than it is at noon, because we'll have a huge rush, and the sound and the lights and everything will be an overwhelming environment. Executive dysfunction is a barrier for most of us who are autistic and ADHD. We may simply forget that we have an appointment, even if we've written it down in 4 different places, especially students who are stressed out and anxious. High levels of social anxiety. So even when there's help available, some students will have trouble accepting that help. Fear of rejection or being misunderstood is very common. I feel like we're a misunderstood group of people quite frequently, neurodivergent people. Sometimes we just say something that we believe is simple and straightforward, and other people take it to mean other kinds of things, or suggest that we have a hidden agenda when we don't, and things like that. So when that happens enough times over the course of your life, it's going to make it tough to get the sorts of support that you need. So experiences of bullying, many autistics like myself and other neurodivergent people experience bullying, sometimes all through childhood, sometimes to a degree that has brought trauma. And so we have to be aware of those things. Lack of formal support throughout their life. Some people are showing up to college now with support, with a diagnosis, with a plan, and that's great, but many are still not and have never really had good support. They're showing up with mental health difficulties, high levels of stress, depression, sometimes suicidal thoughts. Overall, having lower self-esteem is true with most of the autistic students that I've worked with. And that's something that we can build on in our support systems. Being vulnerable to abusive relationships or people taking advantage, this has had an impact on many autistic people. It's something to sort of bear in mind. Lifelong experiences of being an outsider, being left out, or feeling left out of a group, sometimes even feeling invisible. Social withdrawal, masking autistic traits, which is something most people have to do just to get by in school or on the job. So what are some ways that we can help? In my experience, working with, we have a group called SEND. I'll talk about them just for a second. It stands for, this is a student-driven group, and it was student-created and student-developed. SEND stands for Students for Education on Neurodiversity. And this began as a group, a small group of autistic and ADHD students who understood that they needed a different level of support. And so I was just talking recently with some folks at a university, and this comes a little lower in the list, but we were talking about a sort of three-prong plan for supporting neurodivergent students. The neurodivergent student group, so that would be SEND in our case, and if there isn't one on your campus, that certainly can be created or developed. I would think to reach out to autistic students, especially any of those who are outspokenly autistic, which we have a number of them here, which is wonderful, and we reach out for leadership, you know, in that group. So we've got a peer support group, essentially. That's the first prong. The second would be an academic support team, or we call it the Academic Enrichment Center here. If there are academic or cognitive needs, or just even communication needs between a student and a professor, if a student feels unable to approach a professor and needs some support, they may be able to get that help from the Academic Enrichment Center, who communicates. Our campus is small enough where those folks communicate with profs on behalf of students sometimes, if that seems useful to the student. So we've got the student-led group, got the Academic Enrichment Center, and then the third piece of it for support would be the Counseling Center for mental health needs, for meds, for therapy, etc. So that's the kind of three-prong approach, but I'll read a few other things that can be done. Places where I have seen a toned down sensory space created specifically for autistic and neurodivergent students, that is a really powerful, it's an amazing thing to have, and it's also powerful symbolically, because they walk into a room and they say, this space was actually made with me in mind. I'm not intruding, I'm not in the wrong place. This is a place where I can drop the mask and get real about everything that's going on. So I think that's a good place to start, especially be aware of lights and sounds. When people say, how can I help, what can we do, and they want practical advice, I almost always start with understand the neurodiversity paradigm. And I would juxtapose that to a pathology or a deficit model, which is kind of the prevailing medical model, which has been brought up. Understand why someone who has carried a lot of shame, for example, for being different their whole life, would cling to it. The notion that not only are you not different, there are folks out there like you, and this thing has a name, and it gives us a certain kind of identity, and let's get together and find some strength in that. And so understanding the neurodiversity paradigm, I think, is key. And then the third bullet on this slide, moving from awareness of the neurodiversity paradigm to a kind of ownership of it. You know, coming to a Zoom like this is, I think, a wonderful thing, super helpful. But I hope that it's a starting point for many people and not an end point. I would say if you learn stuff here and you want to learn a little bit more, then take that step toward ownership. I don't know what that might look like. Buy a book by an autistic author, watch a movie. I mean, there are so many resources out there that are neurodivergent led resources, neurodivergent created resources. You can read a blog, you can watch a TikTok, I suppose. There's a lot of really good content out there created by young neurodivergent people who are telling their stories. Inviting autistics to lead, I think, is just absolutely key. That's kind of how I came into SEND. When I was publishing some essays before this recent memoir came out, I had the, I was publishing essays on being autistic. And so some students came up to me and said, "We know you're autistic. We have a group of autistic students. Do you want to come be the faculty advisor?" And so we could lead together. Account for executive dysfunction whenever in a sort of a judgment-free zone, if you will, whenever students are involved. Things like I see so much frustration on the faces of colleagues sometimes when it comes to our neurodivergent students. They can't accept or understand why it is that someone can't manage time when they're 18 plus years old, or begin a task and then see it to completion. All these things that fall under the umbrella of executive dysfunction. And it's a very tough way to live, especially when you're in college and it's all about deadlines, deadlines, deadlines. How can we be a little more helpful to folks for whom those traditional frameworks just don't do the trick? Just to finish up then, don't be afraid of harmless stimming behaviors. Sometimes for the first time that folks are around autistic students who are not masked, they may be a little put off by some harmless stimming behaviors, but if those are indeed harmless, don't ask people to suppress them. It's really, really crucial for emotional and physical self-regulation to allow people to stim. Don't force greetings. Instead, maybe facilitate relationship. That's one that is pretty obvious. And then lastly, I say pray for neurodivergent people. Pray for your neurodivergent students and for wisdom and insight to be able to help them as they come your way. I think that's probably good for me then for now. So I'm going to stop sharing this.
So thanks, Professor Bowman, for your ideas and insights. And I think probably a lot of the people viewing on here are interested in practical tips, and you really pointed out some really nice practical tips. And I think that, you know, part of the discussion I want to have around this is about how we develop those and share those better. And so that's going to be part of what I want to talk about. But there were a couple of questions that sort of hit on this one topic, but we had already hit on it in this. So I'm going to just reflect for myself for a minute, and then I'm going to turn it over to each of you or you as a group to see if you have any thoughts on one another's presentations or this situation in general. But, you know, there's this idea, and there's a question on it. We might get to that specific question, but there's this idea about cutting corners. And you know, are we cutting corners for students? And I want to address that because I feel like we really, as educators, need to think about the distinction between learning content and complying with norms. Your goal as an educator is to educate students in content, course content. And there's a lot of mechanisms through which we think those things should happen. We have our own ideas about, you know, you need to learn with other people. There's research, quote unquote, that shows this, but that's not true for everyone. And it's actually not that strong of an effect versus, you know, some people can learn individually equally fast. And also in general, you can learn in different ways. And so these assumptions that we have about the ways that we do it, one of my biggest pet peeves is turning things on time. Don't get me wrong. I understand there's a need to have students turn things on time and not be supported in doing that. But that ultimately is not about learning. That's about social acclimation so that when you graduate and you have a job, that you show up on time and that you meet deadlines so that you can succeed. And if we're at Jesuit institutions and other institutions that value developing the student, I think of that as a secondary goal. And I think of that as something that they might develop during their time at university. the goal that I have in my classroom is for every student to learn, not for every student to follow the rules and to learn in the specific way that I think they should learn, because even I don't know the variety of different ways people should learn. So I think as a professor, for those of you who are on here, as a professor, administrator, thinking about your primary goal is to learn content, and all these other ancillary goals about turning things on time and et cetera, the way that you receive information, the way that you process information, it's really secondary to educating the person. And then you have, at a Jesuit institution, you have this other primary task, which is to develop the person. And that doesn't mean punishing them and demotivating them by giving them poor grades for turning something. And I'm not saying, again, that people should flex the rules, but supporting people in becoming skilled at those necessary skills is maybe a long-term goal for some of our learners. And this is not unique to autism or neurodiversity. This is in general thinking about how we can focus the variety of people in various different who people are diverse in various different ways, about how we can support them to learn, right? And that's really what this is about. And that's who we are as educators. So I just wanted to open up the floor to the speakers, the participants, if you have anything that you'd like to reflect on your own or on the other speakers' presentations.
I was going to jump ahead and comment on the question I saw for me, which you kind of was starting to talk about it. Can I do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So the question about like, how do we convince people that it's not lowering standards, right? I just want to point out, this is the exact same conversations that universities had when we thought about including women, about including Black folks, about including other brown and other marginalized identities of people. It is, and it's the same reason always that we gave them back is because they are students at our university. Whether you accommodate them or not, or whether or not you make them feel welcome, we're still here. And it makes everyone's job a lot easier if we stop pretending that people like me aren't welcome in your classroom because I grew up poor, because I grew up in a public school instead of a prestigious, like private school or whatever, or that I'm neurodivergent. I have just a right to be in that classroom, and by making things clear, you're making it more welcome for everyone. And it also is way less work for you when you make your expectations clear and what your outcomes are going to be. And I know, Joe, I think a big thing we hear about is like, stop turning things in on time. Great. There are some, I will not argue that, I mean, I will argue there are some programs in which having things in a timely manner is absolutely crucial to the core of what that is. But that's not always the case. I'm going to go down a rabbit hole if I don't stop talking. So I'm going to share the space. I saw Brooke wanted to speak as well.
Oh, I think just to echo what you were saying, Emily, like I think as I have been on my own kind of unlearning process about what it means to educate my students and to participate in that journey, like the lateness example is like kind of a key one, because I thought, well, why am I doing this? Because I was always penalized if I didn't turn something in on time. So I guess that's what I learned. But it doesn't have to be that way. And so I thought, well, what do I really value? I value communicating with the student. And so for me, I just have a form and they can just fill it out for any reason and say, I need some more time. And so long as we're communicating, then for me, that's part of the educational process, because it turns out I'm late more than I'd like to admit as well. And so I think, yeah, just to echo what you're saying, I think it really, it's better for everybody. Everybody's here. Let's make it the most kind of productive and effective experience for everybody. So yeah, amen to all you said.
I was just thinking as you were both talking, a student that I had with ADHD a year or two ago, who sitting in my office just crying because of the overwhelm and really stuff like pathological demand avoidance, and these things that, and after a while I had to look at her and say, this is your neurotype. This is not your fault. You're not a bad person. And if it gets to that point, I mean, that's serving our students. First of all, it's trying to alleviate some of that shame they carry around, or probably have carried around since they were little children. And then from that point on, if you have a breakthrough, then learning can take place. I don't know if it can before that. So.
Yeah, I wanted to also just address this point that you brought up of lower self-esteem, trauma experience, and vulnerability. I also wanted to highlight that autistic people often have reduced social networks, especially if they're living away from home. They often will, have this connectivity with their family members and local people who they've known for a long time. And so this makes them more vulnerable. And, combining the lower self-esteem with often high standards. If you're at college and you're autistic, research shows that you're going to be hypercritical of yourself relative to other people. And so those little failures can build up and sort of, feed off of this. And so, and then the other thing to think about is, the masking, so if you're required to be engaging in social participation throughout your entire class, at some point, this secondary task that you're doing, trying to make sure you follow all the rules and you don't embarrass yourself and you don't, and that you present yourself in a way that, doesn't make you stand out or doesn't make you uncomfortable or other people uncomfortable, that taxes your executive functions, that taxes your focus, and it taxes you overall, and it makes you less capable of learning. So something that for someone else might be, in theory or in practice, a benefit to their learning by socializing, discussing things, et cetera, can actually be a direct and indirect barrier to learning for autistic and people with social anxiety, et cetera. And so, again, just these assumptions that we have as a society that we have to have a social learning environment and that that's the best way to do it, and that we have to turn things on, et cetera, et cetera. We could go through a whole bunch of things. Anything that anyone wanted to add to that before we maybe move on to a different topic?
Sorry, Joe, this is also tying into the question I saw in the chat about some classroom management strategies of, I realized I used to teach special ed, so I taught in K-12, and a lot of our teaching is teaching classroom norms and teaching what is expected. I don't think professors know how to do that. And that's because it's not part of your training to become a professor, right? And that's not a criticism, it's just, it is assumed from the elitism that is higher ed that people should know how to do these things. However, Joe, how you may run your class, Brooke, how you might run your class, and Dan, how you may run your class, all of your social expectations are going to be different. And students are expected to guess what you're expecting, and I will get it wrong 8 out of 10 times. Those rock star when I get it right those 2 times. So when students were interrupting, a lot of times it's because they heard what you said. Like, I really had to like sit on my hands. I was like, literally, I was so excited about what Joe was saying, so I didn't interrupt him. Because I've gotten used to social cues somehow. But if you haven't said explicitly, how you want people to share in the classroom, consider doing that. Raising your hand first, or I used to have like a QR code that would be in all the slides when I was teaching. So if a student wanted to share, but they didn't want to raise their hand and have everyone hear it, they could type in the comment and we could do it that way. I'm sorry, I was getting distracted by the comments and I got very excited. Sorry.
No, that's great. Absolutely no reason to apologize. I mean, I think that, in the comments and questions, people are interested in strategies. And so I want to address some of those questions, but I also want to go to this higher level and address the sort of barriers to this and spreading this throughout the Jesuit universities, and how do we come up with standards of practice and convince professors that these are the right standards of practice to at least be considering, right? And sort of how do we influence universities, Jesuit and non-Jesuit, and how do we influence society as a whole? So here's a question. Can you provide some examples of how I might alter my grading or assessment in light of neurodiversity? Right, and these might be case specific, but does anyone have any suggestions or examples of those types of things?
For me, this has meant a journey towards ungrading. So that is not something I feel like I have perfected by any means. But I am coming more and more to a place where I have a lot of, in an effort to set very clear expectations, a lot of very hopefully clear rubrics. We discuss them together, we amend them together if they're not clear, and then kind of work on a completion basis. And then I've done things like labor-based grading, which I found was really hard, and people had a lot of anxiety about keeping track of what had been done and hadn't been done. And now I'm moving more towards kind of a more true kind of ungrading method, which requires a lot of individual meetings with students, which then raises questions about class size. So I find myself sometimes with 90-ish students in a semester, and that's a lot of students to sit down with individually and do narrative evaluations. And I think it's tricky too, because even though I feel like for me that has been a move in the right direction and students have responded well, it also, I'm learning about the ways that like that creates anxiety for people and how can I help alleviate, so I think for me, that's been my particular journey. But I'm also finding that I really have to ask students about what works for them in terms of feedback, in terms of evaluation, in terms of what they're expecting for themselves, what their goals are. But yeah, it's I don't have the answer, but that's my journey for now.
Right, let's take another audience question. So how do I balance my positionality as a young woman professor with accommodating male autistic students' unintentionally disruptive behavior? For example, interrupting me while I'm speaking. So this has happened to me in ways that have made me feel like my hard-won authority in the classroom is being undermined, even though I know the student doesn't mean to be disrespectful. I just want to, before you answer the question, I want to highlight there's a lot of misunderstanding too about co-occurring conditions. So this type of disruptive behavior probably is more associated with a co-occurring ADHD, which is common in autistic people, and so inability to stop yourself. So not all autistic people interrupt you, and in fact, quite the opposite. A lot of them never speak, and so in the classroom, for example. So I just wanted to highlight that there's a little bit more going on here, but that this is definitely going to be more common in autistic males, for example.
I could start, I guess. I mean, it certainly happens. It's happened in my life many times. There are autistic people I meet, and right away I know it's going to be somebody who's going to talk me up and down, and it's going to maybe be hard to get away eventually. I tend to just figure out how to redirect that person in a way that seems really respectful. That's about the best thing I can do. And a lot of times, for me, it's just being super clear with them, and I rarely have I had hurt feelings or anything like that when that happens. But the experience of a woman in the classroom is going to be different. So I mean, I want to hear about that too.
Yeah, so I can speak again as a man, but I can give some strategies, and then I'd like to hear what the two female participants think. So strategies would be, appealing to the fact that a lot of autistic people are willing to follow rules, and that you could tell them, you maybe should only participate this many times during my class, and that's up to the professor to decide what that is. But you could put a limit on how many times they participate, and you could talk to them after class if they over participate, right? So that would be one way of handling it. And then another way to handle it would be to, again, come up with other rules about how you participate and whether or not you're able to be included in that class if you over participate and interrupt. And so I think, the idea would be to start with very reasonable, achievable goals, and maybe have some discussion about what those reasonable, achievable goals are. And in that discussion, you might learn that this individual can participate in some other way, or can ask those questions at a different time. And maybe it just means you talk after class a little bit more, or you give them an alternative way to participate. And there's much more that can be done here. Every situation is unique, but those are some very specific examples. I think a lot of times people are scared to offend or upset an autistic person, and everyone understands and respects that. But I think I don't want to speak for the autistic people in the room, but in general, I would say people be clear, be honest, be open, have some discussion with me, be respectful, and we'll come up with a solution together at some level, right?
My favorite line to say is, "I'm not sure you're aware, but you just interrupted me." I would, and then I'll just keep going, because clear is kind, and I know that I interrupt people a lot too, and so I don't want to be the person that's perceived as rude. I don't want to be perceived as being disrespectful, or that I don't care about what someone else's thoughts are. But also my impulse control is the area of weakness for me. So I just think of being like firm and confident and saying, I'm not sure where you just interrupted me. I want to hear what you have to say, but please keep your hand first next time. That's just one way that I do it. I've gotten used to having to realize if I'm not saying what I mean, people are going to interpret it however they want. and guess their own meaning. Because when we're communicating, our brain's decoding a message, and then we're speaking the message, and then that person's getting a message, and their brain's decoding what you mean. Using plain, clear language reduces miscommunication, which can have the best outcomes.
Dr. Kwalkwia, would you mind, because you're a flexible and seemingly, sort of engaging professor, and can you speak from the perspective of being a female professor and how you manage these kinds of things when they arise?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you said that, because I think like this was kind of under my kind of maybe a more traditional model. I felt like I encountered that maybe more, but also like maybe that's to do, I don't know what all the variables are, but I will say that now I'm with Emily, that kind of just the clarity of expectations. I often will give students an agenda on the slides at the beginning of class so that they know exactly what's going to happen. And then they know when I will walk us through and say, we're going to do this, and I'm going to talk a lot here, and then you get to talk here. And then we're going to do this small group activity, and then we're going to produce this artifact together or whatever, right? Thank you. It's been a long time coming, but it makes a difference. And so I feel like that framework has reduced those encounters, which really I understand that feeling of really feeling undermined, particularly when I was kind of newer, young female faculty member. Absolutely identify with that experience. And that clarity has helped a lot, I think. So
this is great. And you're pointing out a whole nother strategy, which is the proactive strategy, right? And so that proactive strategy is to lay out the ground rules in the beginning. And for autistic people, anxious people, even people with ADHD, being very clear about what you mean by that. Don't, hey, show respect to one another, et cetera, et cetera. That's a great thing to say, but what are the actual behaviors and statements that we make that make someone be respectful? And if you're not clear about that, then maybe you're going to have those happen more often. And then you're going to have to push back. And it's really a misunderstanding at some level. And I want to harken back to what Emily has said about this, I'm drawing a blank there, but this idea of, oh, sorry, I lost that point. Okay, so, okay. So I want to talk about belonging here. So it is a question, and I'm going to read the question, but then I want you to also think about belonging. Are there opportunities on your campuses for neurodiverse people to gather together socially, and for neurodiverse students also to educate each other? More generally, how can our campuses be more helpful in enabling neurodiverse people to build a sense of community with one another? And so I would like for you guys to reflect on this idea of belonging as an autistic community on campus, but also belonging more broadly in the campus, which is obviously something that's a topic in DEI and something that we should be influenced by and pulling from.
I could start. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, Dan, go for it.
I was just going to real quickly say that it is such a good question because right now, and I wonder how it is at your universities, there's more traffic sort of coming from admissions right now in my life. There are families who will call the university ahead of time and say, we're going to come down for a visit. My daughter's looking at X, Y, and Z. She's autistic. What do you have in place that can help us and things like that? And many times in the last couple of years, admissions is kind of scratching their heads because they're not, they've never been in that world before. That's not something they're accustomed to thinking through. And I became a de facto liaison just because I was autistic and I wrote a book about it. So I started fielding actually a bunch of emails from families and parents, and then a couple weeks later they'd be in my office and we'd be talking with their student right there. So the sense of belonging and the sense of support that that they'll receive when they get to campus is such a huge issue. So I just wanted to affirm that.
This is not an ad, but what similar to what St. Joseph's done is Marquette, we've developed On Your Mark, which is a place for neurodivergent students to come and be supported in the multiple ways they need support, as well as forge community and find ways to get support in accessing community, like the university as a whole, in terms of belonging and how do we join clubs, how do we talk to my professor about this, really putting their identity as Marquette student first and helping them access that to the various supports they might need.
And yeah, and some campuses are doing this more than others. And one of the things I want to talk about is how we change that. And so before I get to that, though, I do want to bring up, one of the areas where you can have a sense of belonging on our campuses is the ministry offices. And we've certainly had students on the spectrum who spend a lot of their time in service in ministry. And so I wanted to ask, one of the questions is for Dan, but others can chime in. So Jesuit campuses all have campus ministry offices and programs. I wonder if you might give 3 or 4 pointers, particularly to campus ministers that may help them to appropriately minister to the neurodiverse student, staff, and faculty in their communities.
I think so much for me, so much that I've learned about how to support neurodivergent students is relational. I think so much of it is just building relationships. And so I end up having, I want to build lots of good relationships with my creative writers, for example. That's my sweet spot. That's what I teach the most. And you see them through, you see a cohort through all 4 years and everything. But now I've kind of got students of all majors in the SEND group that I advise. And I see them when they come in, and then I see them maybe a year later when they have had support in place through the peer group and sometimes through counseling and sometimes through meds and other avenues. And I think the more relational we are with them, the better we know them. When we catch up with them, we can ask them specific questions about back home or family, or some of them are going through a diagnostic process. It's really challenging and really expensive, and they don't know how it's going to be, and all sorts of things like that. So that's probably the key for me is building relationships and just knowing who these people are. They will come back. If they feel safe, they will come back, because you're talking about a population that's rarely felt safe in their lives. And so if you have made them feel safe as a campus minister, campus pastor, whatever, and then they come back, even if they're not saying much, if they're hanging around, that's a good sign. So just keep going.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. So I wanted to see if we could orient, as we're getting to the last 15 minutes here. What do we think about the idea of standards for neurodiversity friendly or neurodiverse supporting campuses and educational practices? I mean, and not every campus is going to have a specific autism support program like St. Joe's does, or a broad one that is very knowledgeable about autism, like Marquette does. But there are professors who want to know that a lot of the questions in this are about, what do I do? What do I do? Right. And of course, it's all individualized and et cetera, but there could be standards, right? And so, what do you think about the idea of creating, informational, educational, and sort of almost expectations for care and support for this population? And how would something like that go about, or what would it look like?
I really think if we think about what we did to prepare students to arrive at university in the fall of 2020, when there wasn't the ability for people to come and visit campuses, and we didn't have time to communicate, didn't have a way to communicate to people what to expect and what those expectations are. The pandemic taught us so much about how we can make things more accessible. And that's a pretty small thing that people can do to I'm speaking for myself, but a lot of my students also share that knowing what they can expect helps them navigate better and reduces a lot of that anxiety and reduces a lot of that, how do I know if I'm going to be fitting in? How do I know if I'm going to feel like I belong there? And I think it also overall, if people know what to expect and know what the requirements are, they can meet it.
Yeah, and for those who are motivated, I think that they can make changes to their classroom just like they do in the other DEI related initiatives, right? And so, can you think of ways that we could motivate those faculty who aren't in this video call, for example, who aren't listening right now? How do we get to those people? And how do we impact change? So we've had some, email conversations about cura personalis. We've had some discussions about various different things relate to, educating people versus, supporting people and developing their themselves broader than that. But how do we motivate faculty to do these things? Do you have any thoughts or insights or ideas about that?
I don't know the answer. But I do know that one place that we are having some of these conversations is through our Center for Faculty Excellence. So kind of in the lead up to this, at the end of this month, I'm going to be leading a panel, including students who are neurodivergent, about kind of like what would be helpful, telling their stories about their kind of classroom experiences and what would be helpful, and providing a space for that conversation to happen. So that's one thing we're trying here, is using that center as an outlet for kind of some of this conversation to happen, and for us to kind of network with each other and share ideas and experiences. And I don't know. So, but I don't know how you motivate people.
Yeah, I mean, so building off of that, so you're talking about an existing sort of training and development. And so one of the questions that was brought up in Emily's presentation, but also just more generally, is this idea of linking in with DEI. So at St. Joe's, we do have a day of dialogue. It's actually this coming Tuesday. And we do have a number of neurodiversity related presentations and trainings in that. And so people, you know, they want to, if they want to learn about this, or if they feel it's important and that something they could work on, or at least learn about and think about, then they can participate in those. So piggybacking on some of these existing resources where faculty feel obliged to participate, you know, it's sort of like a continuing education unit option, right? That you could choose this, and then encouraging people. Yeah.
The idea of honoring the whole person, right? And someone's neurotype is part of who they are, just like someone's race is, just like someone's gender is, sexual identity, all of those things that we need to honor in people, because that is part of who they are. And, you know, I said earlier, you wouldn't say to someone, well, why do we have to make women welcome here? Why do we have to make Black kids welcome here? Those conversations don't happen anymore. And it feels, maybe because it's Black History Month and I'm a Black person, like it feels very much of like, these are the same conversations we were having in the 60s, same conversation we were having in the 70s, and it's 2024. And a lot of the ways that we make any marginalized group of students feel welcome is the way we make neurodivergent students feel welcome.
Yeah, excellent points.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna speak to that just really quickly. That's to sort of flip that around. We, you know, at Taylor, for example, we have a really strong Black student union. The BSU has been there for a long, long time. Right now, it's highly visible because it's in the student union, which is a building that has some fast food places and huge amounts of traffic for coffee and lunch and everything. I would love to look at a model like that and increase the visibility for whatever neurodivergent group ends up with. If we get a physical space on campus ultimately, or have some events and things like that, you know, just to increase visibility so people are aware that we're here and that we're doing our thing.
Yeah, that's great. You know, and I think some of it's going to be increasing the relevance to the faculty. So you know, there are high rates of anxiety in college students as well without autism, and there are high rates of ADHD. On our campus, I feel like we have more females with ADHD than I would have expected. And so this idea that it's not just that one student in your class, it's just not just that those two students you're going to come across this year. It's actually all of your students. And this goes back to your point, Emily, about this helps everyone. It helps your students who have no neurodivergence whatsoever to have accurate information and to be prepared. And you know, and you know, you're, you know, sort of motivating the professors by showing how it improves their overall approach and supports more than just that one student. And that there's, going back to Brooke's examples, like proactive things you can do to save yourself from experiencing these problems. Not every single problem, you're still going to run into some problems, but you can cut a lot of this off by being proactive and just changing some very simple things. Like, for example, how you describe how we participate. You know, it's not about, it is about respect, but it's about specific things that we do to show respect for one another, and that we go back and forth, and it's not just you, it's also me, etc. And speaking about things differently with clarity is something that's small that can go a really long way, but takes a little advanced planning, right? And we're all overworked at some level, right, in our classes, but you know, these kinds of things I think are part of that. One of the things I wanted to bring up too is this idea of continuing connectivity with our neurodiverse students, right? So, you know, at St. Joe's, we do have the Aspire program, and The director of that program, Teresa McFalls, and her team have tracked that the students are graduating at approximately the same rate as the general population students here, which is great. And then we do also have great job numbers, in terms of percentages who are obtaining jobs, and again, quite similar to the general population. And so we've been having some discussions lately about how we sort of, maintain that connectivity, both to have feedback, reflective, how were things 5 years out for reflecting on your experience at our university, but also, do you feel like you're still part of this community? And this goes back to the belonging topic. And do you feel like you can come back to us for support and et cetera, just like anyone else would, or, maybe less so, more so, et cetera. So any thoughts on any of this stuff? Emily, do you have any students, because you've worked with a number of students, do you have any neurodiverse students who you think might be a good example for thinking about, how things have gone beyond? I mean, obviously without naming names, but any examples that you can just describe?
So in terms of belonging, it's National Marquette Day on Saturday. And alumni from all over the country, all over the world come back to Milwaukee, like it's like a homecoming but different, and celebrate. And I had a student email me saying, "Hey, I'm going to be back on campus. I'm really excited to be there. Hope I can swing by and say hello to you too." And this was a student who, for newer programs, so they just graduated about 2 years ago now. But it's really cool to see that students feel just as engaged in Marquette as their like a neurotypical peer. I don't know if other people's universities have that strong, very much alumni network that Marquette has, of being a Marquette student is such a core part of who their identity.
Right.
And the thing is that makes me think of is that my neurodivergent students often need so much more downtime, and I'm the same way. And there's a pressure here on our campus to do so many different activities all the time. In one sense, those are the ones who end up coming back for a homecoming or for the things that they identify strongly with the university because they did all these things. They have all these pictures and memories. The autistic kids maybe could do about half of the things that everybody else could do. And so in some cases, I think trying to account for that sense of belonging while their experiential realm of socializing on the campus is going to look a little different from how their neurotypical peers experienced it.
Yeah, I would say on average that's true, although at St. Joe's, and I'm sure at other universities too, there are some students who are heavily involved in some of these activities, including activities that they're sort of initially ancillarily associated with. But yes, on average, for sure, you're going to have a little bit less participation, et cetera, and maybe a little longer timeline in the first couple of years to figure out where they want to be and who they want to belong with as well. So, all right, well, we're going to wrap up in the next few minutes, but I just wanted to see if any of you have any thoughts on next steps for your own work or next steps for the just group of Jesuit universities more generally, or if you have any dreams about where things are going to head in the next 5 to 10 years on this topic. And if it's a big question, but if you have anything about next steps or big picture ideas, that would be great.
I could start real quick. For me, again, I'm just a writer. I'm just a creative writer and a storyteller. So my what I look for in the next few years are stories, and this goes back to Brooke's presentation. Stories that are quote own voices, which was a hashtag from a few years back that indicated that if you have an autistic protagonist, for example, in your story, that you have the lived experience of being autistic and therefore some kind of sense of authority to write that character. I would love to see more own voices books in every category. I'd love to see more autistic poetry, fiction, graphic novels. The old notion, that we have for kids, if you can see it, you can be it. Well, I'd like for them to see autistic scientists and astronauts and also creative writers and actors and lots of different things. So I'm going to keep trying to contribute to that body of work. That's my goal.
Yeah, that's great. And I would like to add that to that, I agree with you completely that we need more of these narrative stories. And I think we need more that incorporate intersectionality. I think we need more examples of people who are managing and living through intersectionality in that context. Emily, Brooke, any thoughts?
I would love to not have to have these kind of talks. in the future, and that this is just part of, we do this because we know it works and that we know it makes our institutions more welcoming, and it improves from a bottom line standpoint, it improves outcomes.
Excellent. Yeah, and it's a very reasonable expectation, and hopefully this kind of discussion is how we're going to get there, and then some action following. Any thoughts from you, Brooke?
I think just you put it so beautifully, Emily, like that we don't need these conversations anymore. And that I think for me, kind of just a kind of continuing journey to like what's better for kind of the more vulnerable person in this particular space is generally better for everybody, right? And to kind of just be continuing to move in that direction more and more boldly.
Yeah, and thinking flexibly about this idea of, is your teaching practice modifying or being clear about your teaching practice? Is that going to hurt any other students? And if it sort of goes back to this idea of inclusive design and inclusive education. And if your modification or addition is not going to interfere with someone else's learning, then it seems like a good idea, and that might be a good way to go. Well, I want to thank Dr. McCartan again for organizing this. I am so glad that I got to meet all of you here on the panel, and I'm glad that we got to speak to our community. And thank you for those of you who came and listened to us and submitted your questions as well. Thanks so much, everyone.